Here we are, CFX, the connection of things. Last year I had the opportunity to write a chapter in an upcoming Edward Elgar book called the cumulative effect, what's it called now? Cumulative Impacts Handbook. And in that chapter, I was asked to write about watershed risk assessment and cumulative effects. And you might recall that I talked about that publication in the November 20 episode of CFX, The Connection of Things with Dr. Jill Blakely, November 20th, 2020. You can go back and see that if you want. But in writing that chapter, I made the argument that we need to understand the cumulative effects of all the components within a watershed in order to be able to effectively do watershed risk assessment. We need to be able to understand how the big system operates and all of those connections, right? I often call that the big picture. And my reasoning is that if we understand all of those connections, then we also understand how that influences or affects big system outcomes like clean drinking water. And then when we have that understanding, then we can more appropriately understand the implications for a new project, as an example, in that larger context, and whether it's going to contribute to or detract from what we're trying to accomplish. Look, water drives the environment, right? Water is life. Water is essential to every animal and plant. And it's easy to just think about water as an environmental value, but make no mistake, water is an ecological good that is absolutely critical for social and economic prosperity. And my guest today is Dr. Ryan MacDonald. And Ryan is a senior hydrologist at MacHydro, and he's dedicated his entire career to understanding these different connections and how we can use that information and knowledge and understanding to create a better future. So welcome to CFX, The Connection of Things, Ryan.
Thank you, Barry.
Ryan is also the recipient of the 2019 CE Analytic Innovation Award, and I've got a link in the show notes below if you want to learn more about that award. But it was really recognizing his innovation and creativity around bringing together climate, water systems, and land use. So really cool stuff. Ryan, we've got lots to talk about. I'm going to cue that show music, and let's get rolling. Okay, Ryan, let's let everybody know a little bit more about you, who you are, the work that you do, and your company, MacHydro.
Yeah, so I guess I'm Ryan MacDonald. I've been doing hydrologic work, I guess since the early 2000s, as I started out as an undergraduate and then did a little bit of environmental consulting. Went through grad school and it really honed my interest in on aquatic ecosystems. So I love fishing. I've always loved fishing, since I was a little boy. Relating back to water, my first days in rivers, right? It's just like
Yeah.
that was the most important thing to me, and still is one of the most important things in my life. So it kind of led me to trying to understand the interaction between water and fish is really what I wanted to do. And
Cool.
um, as a young academic and upcoming kind of scientist, I really wanted to look at things like water temperature. So how does hydrology affect water temperature? I also love skiing, so I wanted to understand, how does snow change? What drives snow and why it occurs where it does and how it changes over time and space. So really my interest kind of went along with my recreational activities and why I wanted to kind of be in watersheds and understanding, water on the landscape. And then I wanted to, essentially, I started out kind of going down the academic route and then found myself, just finding an interest in kind of the consulting world. And that's what led to our really small company called Mac Hydro. We're a really small group of pretty specialized, I guess, professionals in watershed modeling, cumulative effects, and I guess understanding the interaction between land use, climate, and hydrology.
And your company is based in Western Canada, but your reach is quite broader than that, right? In the work that you do is larger than just in like southern British Columbia.
Yeah, we do. Our projects are largely focused in BC and Alberta, but the work that we do is definitely applicable at much larger scales.
Yeah, yeah, it's cool. It's really cool how time and again I find that what people end up doing in their life and in their professional pursuits are often driven by passions and interests they had as a young person. Same for me. So
Yeah.
yeah, cool. Thanks for sharing that. All of us can relate to going fishing, catching our first fish, the sun dancing off of the water there. I remember my first one was at Crane Lake. It was a northern pike, jackfish. Pretty small, but the whole campsite knew about it, and I was pretty damn excited. So
Nice.
yeah, it just feels like yesterday. Ryan, let's watersheds and hydrology are pretty complex. So maybe let's just cover a few basics here before we get into some of that complexity. Can you just sort of help us understand really, what is a watershed and generally how do they work?
Yeah. One of the interesting things I like to ask people, especially younger people, is, where does the water come from out of your tap? And
Mm.
the answer is almost always at the tap. Um, and so I do think it's really important to understand, what is a watershed? And a watershed ultimately is all of the land, all of the area of the land that contributes to a specific water body. So we could think of a river or a lake. It's all of the areas, so the cumulative area that contributes to that river or lake. So if we think about, in the mountains, it's pretty easy to conceptualize a watershed because we can think about it as kind of like a mountain valley. So all
Right.
of the area that kind of runs off of that mountain valley is what's contributing to the water. Um, in a prairie environment, a watershed's a bit trickier to kind of think about, but it's still the same concept as all of the area that's contributing to those rivers and lakes. So that's ultimately what a watershed is. If you can kind of look upstream from where you're standing and think about the entire area that's contributing to that upstream environment.
Yeah, I grew up a good part of my life out in mid-continent Canada, and yeah, it's a little more subtle. The
Yeah,
the areas in the watersheds are way larger,
yeah,
um, way
yeah.
way
That's one
larger.
thing we do find. They grow dramatically as we move east in Canada.
Yeah. Now, you know, I don't know who said this, but I've actually quoted this. It seems to be relatively commonly quoted. The wisdom is so true though that what is done on the land is written in the water. I love that saying, and it's true. Like when you're measuring in water, whether it's temperature or suspended sediment or flow rates, it's really a reflection of everything that's happening in that watershed, especially above it, right?
Yeah, yeah, it really is. And there's another really good quote actually from one of the books that we'll share today is uh, water doesn't come from the river, it comes to the river. And that's from
Ah,
Kevin Van Tighem. It's a really nice way to think about it is, yeah, we've often visualized that the rivers and lakes are this kind of entity on their own. They are, but they're very much an integration of everything upstream.
okay. So let's dig in on this. I'm just gonna try something a little different here with my whiteboard. Pull this in and see how this works. But in a simplified way, I think in watersheds it's helpful to try to follow the water. So, we have, and you'll be very impressed with my amazing drawing capabilities. But this is the ground, and here's a cloud, and it rains, right? It rains down on the land. That's what the water comes into the system. And I see it basically as three simple categories of things that happen then to that water. One is that it can be evaporated back up into the air, either by the sun or through evapotranspiration by plants. So they take that water and they throw it back up into the atmosphere. Some of that water also goes down into the ground. So it goes into groundwater aquifers and other things down here. And then some of that water moves overland through creeks and rivers or is stored in lakes or whatever. So kind of three things. It's either thrown back into the atmosphere, it goes into the ground, or it runs off. So that's sort of a simple story, but I guess this is kind of a way to help us understand then what we're doing to the ground is influential in on how the water will respond and react, right? Which is kind of like cumulative effects of human land use on water.
Yeah.
Do you want to give us a little bit more of a description on that, a little more detail?
Sure. And if you could draw two more arrows underneath the ground, going in the same direction as your overland arrow.
Okay.
We have something there, which is essentially water moving through the soil. And then
Right.
an arrow below that would be water moving, essentially. Water moving from the ground into, essentially deeper water, groundwater into, and if you draw a river or lake, there you go. So those three arrows ultimately lead to rivers and lakes. So we've got water coming from the shallow surface, the say mid-surface, and the deeper water.
So what's going on? All the same things that we sort of see on the surface are happening underneath.
Essentially, yeah. So in a nutshell, we have water that's kind of moving through as a system. And when you look at a river or a lake, the water that's in those rivers and lakes is a combination of all of those different sources.
Right.
We also have water that leaves rivers and lakes through a wide range of different. We either have land use that drives water use, or we have natural water uses like evaporation. But what you've really described there is ultimately the water balance. And when we think about cumulative effects, what we're thinking about is how do our activities, whether it be we can change the first part there, so we can change the amount of rain that comes on the landscape through things like climate change. We can alter how watersheds respond to that rain by removing trees, or as you've done there, built a city.
Right.
The rate and timing of water moving off the landscape through the soils, through the groundwater system, is all driven by how we interact with that kind of surface.
So people, I often talk in that big picture. The environment nourishes or provides for people, in this case, water. People then use those resources to create economies to make their lives better. And we have choices around how we use it. And then there are effects or implications for how that happens. And then ultimately, the regenerative notion of this is that a lot of that water ends up in the oceans, goes back up in the atmosphere, comes back inland, and we have this repeating cycle. So that's really interesting. And thanks for pointing out this thing about groundwater, because we often don't think about it because we don't see it.
Yeah, and it's a really important piece. And as a scientist, there's ways we can look at that more explicitly. But I like the quote it's a philosophy quote from Heraclitus that says, "No man ever steps in the same river twice." it's not the same river and it's not the same man. So if you could
Wow.
think about it
Yeah.
not being so, as I was, in my more recent history, often we'll stand in a river, and if I'm fly fishing or measuring something or just hanging out by a river, that thought always comes to mind of the water that you watch going past you is not the same water that was there a second ago. So really, it's an integration of everything that is occurring on the landscape. And when we think about how we affect, the water cycle, if you remove one tree in a watershed, or if you pave over one portion of soil, you are changing the way that that water moves to you or moves to the river system.
And that change, it's constant, and it's been happening forever. Like, because nature is also involved, right? We have wildfires,
Exactly.
we have floods and avalanches and all of that stuff.
Yeah. And one thing we know about water cycles is it's very variable over long and short time scales.
Yeah, I think that's really important. That time scale is a really important thing. That's really interesting, though, about what you're saying about the person is never the same and the water is never the same. And I guess it also opens the door to allow us to think about the fact that what we have today won't always necessarily be what we have or what we want into the future. And so it's also about being in tune or having it's the connection or relationship that we have with the understanding of water that allows us to sort of roll with it, right? As things
Totally.
change,
Yeah.
rather
It is
than
that connection.
fighting against it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we also need to, this isn't necessarily watershed science, but we need to acknowledge that we are water ultimately.
Yeah, right.
That's it. And that's a really important fact of humans.
Absolutely. Well, I had a quote there from before from the Assembly of First Nations about all of the aspects. I'll include it in the show notes. Really interesting point about how water, we've known since time immemorial the connection of people more than just an element that sustains us, but it's in many ways it's a reflection of our power and our persistence on the landscape and our ability to shape things. And I think at the end of that quote, it talks about the fact that we all flow to the ocean at the end of our journey. All of us do.
Yeah.
So we actually join that water, which is really cool.
It is super cool. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is a super interesting conversation. I'm going to switch into our next segment, the Forest of Whispering Speakers, since we're branching out here and thinking a little bit more creatively. I'm going to bring up the next segment. So put up our ribbon, and I always have to have a little bit of bluesy to get me into the right mode here, right? Water. All right. Well, so dating myself here, but I'm a child of the 60s, Ryan. And so I grew up in the 1970s were a lot of my formative years. And so I love that classic rock. I really do. And John Fogerty, Creedence Clearwater Revival, one of those epic bands. John Fogerty, really an amazing artist. When I was researching songs for this episode on water, I mean, there's thousands. Artists worldwide forever have been inspired by water. So there's just so much to choose from. But I was trying to really focus it in on something that's sort of, I guess, personal to me, because I really like this song, but also I think the messages that we get from artists sometimes have many or multiple meanings, and perhaps the message or the knowledge changes with time as well,
Mhm.
how we interpret it. So I have this song here, Who'll Stop the Rain by CCR. And I'm just going to get into just sort of walk through my interpretation of these lyrics. And Ryan, feel free to join in with me on this. But it starts out, he says, long as I can remember, the rain's been coming down. Clouds of mystery pouring confusion on the ground. And I think of that as in the context of what we're talking about. It's the complexity of a watershed. It's been happening forever, and yet there's a lot of misunderstanding about cause and effect and how these things work.
Yeah.
Or perhaps this song was actually kind of a lot of people think it was a protest song about involvement in war and sort of the spin that politics were putting on that in order to justify war. And I often think of now too, like, this confusion is intentional, because if we confuse the situation and we make it really hard to understand, or put conflicting information or narrow the scope, sometimes we're doing that to avoid blame for things that we've done, or perhaps to influence people to think in a certain way to make a decision happen. So clouds of mystery pouring confusion on the ground. But then the next line, good men through the ages trying to find the sun. And so I interpret that then is what you and I are talking about. It's taking the time to have a relationship with water beyond just like the mechanics, the hard mechanics, and understanding how that system comes, right? And so that's kind of like finding the sun, finding the
Mhm.
clarity, right? So, we took an unbelievably complex thing and boiled it down to a few basics that really describe the vast majority of what goes on. So I think that the more we can bring clarity, the more we're going to find the sun through that confusion of the rain. And then it goes on, it says, I went down to Virginia seeking shelter from the storm, caught up in the fable, I watched the tower grow. And this again is, like, perhaps he was intentionally thinking about, the fable or the spin, the political spin. We see it sometimes now in political forces that are trying to shape how we manage our watersheds. And they might be trying to shape the story into what can amount to a fable. And I think what's amazing about the work that Ryan does is without political fettering, he's able to show us all of the connections so that we can understand that clearly and not just accept somebody's interpretation. And it goes on to say 5-year plans and new deals wrapped in golden chains, which is how we articulate the message, right? And again, I think that we talked a little bit about time. And, in cumulative effects assessment, we see this all the time, Ryan, about the time frames. And
Mhm.
whether it's a political election cycle, which is 5 years, or it's the lifespan of a capital investment project, maybe 20 years, the cycles of water operate on a completely different time scale,
Yeah.
don't they? I
Oh,
mean, there's
and
mini and there's big, isn't there?
yeah, yeah. There's really, really short and there's really, really long time scales. And when you think about sort of our professional disciplines of, doing environmental assessment or cumulative effects assessment, we, we've, even our monitoring. So as a hydrologist, like a long-term data set is like 100 years. And
Right.
we know that, that's nothing. That's a blip in terms of time when we think about, the water cycle. And we often lose that context. And it's important to always keep reminding ourselves that we ourselves live in a very short time, live on a very short time span. We live maybe 100 years if we're lucky. Um, but our perception of the way things ought to be is different than the way that they actually are. And that's
Yeah.
often what drives kind of how we interact with the landscape or the water. We see change in a very, very short snapshot.
Cool. I should have got you to do the interpretation of lyrics because I think that's what I was trying to say. You said it very eloquently. Is that really it's our perception or how we could be influenced in a certain direction if we don't understand the system. So the value
Yeah.
of really, and I think of things like, when we talk about climate, we talk about El Nino and La Nina and the 10-year Pacific decadal oscillation. And then there are 100-year cycles. And this leads us into climate change, right?
Yeah.
And so there's,
Yeah, that's a
there's,
long term and a short term phenomena, right?
yeah. So, okay. So let's dig into that because there's a lot of clouds of confusion around that for various reasons. We know that climate change has been happening forever.
Yeah.
It's part of this natural system. I think what's different from the research that I've been looking at, what's different in the last century, or perhaps driven by the significant changes of the Industrial Revolution, is that we're on an exponential curve of one of the drivers, which is the greenhouse gases, are being moved into the system on a scale that hasn't been observed in hundreds of thousands of years. And so we're kind of in uncharted territory. We're really shifting this system. So let's talk about that a little bit. You've helped me understand climate change a lot better in work that we've done together. A lot of time we get forecasts from a group called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a mass consortium of scientists from around the world. And they have these terms called RCP 2.6, 4.5, 8.5. You see it over and over and over again. Can you help us understand what that is?
Yeah. So climate science has evolved substantially over the last couple of decades. And one of the main tools that climate scientists use is a suite of modeling tools. They're referred to as general circulation models or regional climate models. These tools are meant to understand the energy balance of Earth. So they're actually representing, they're very, very complicated models. They're representing how Earth is actually behaving and all of the different, what we call forcings, radiative forcings. So as we've all learned, back in grade school, there is this thing called the greenhouse effect. Greenhouse gases are what ultimately keep us alive here on Earth. They make it warm. There's other gases in the atmosphere that make it cool. But ultimately that's a reflection or a function of the amount of radiation that's being trapped in our atmosphere. And that amount of radiation is as you've described previously, is ultimately increasing over time as a function of increased greenhouse gas emissions. And those RCP 4.5, 8.5, 2.66 are all what they call representative concentration pathways. So what they essentially mean is they're what we project using these climate models to be the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the future. So if we look at a representative concentration pathway of 4.5, that's saying, that's essentially an emissions pathway into the future. So we can use that information to then understand, how might air temperature change, or how might precipitation change, or ocean temperature, ocean currents. So these are very complicated models, but they're ultimately meant to understand the Earth's energy balance.
So that's I think you brought something really important there, that it's about energy, because we often think it's about moisture or greenhouse gases, but really what you're talking about is the movement or containment of energy. Greenhouse gases trap energy and don't let it back out into space, so that's why we get warmer. And those models, they're really interesting because they look at this specific, like the emissions, but they also examine then the socioeconomic implications and
Yeah.
responses of that, and there were feedbacks to drive
Yeah.
continued emissions, right?
Yeah.
So it's the connection of things. It's all of
Mm.
it. You can't just. It's not just the environment, or it's not just economic development. It's all of the things happening. It's kind of mind blowing,
Yeah.
and yet makes sense.
Yeah. And you know, these scientists, kudos to them for creating these models, because there's big groups of scientists all over the world that do this. But as you can imagine, they continue to evolve. So one of the parts of confusion that's goes on in kind of maybe the public domain is that, oh wow, like this different emission scenario results in a different future outcome.
Right.
And we tend to latch on to emission scenarios or models that we think, um, you know, almost like give us what we want out of the system. But the researchers are actually running thousands and thousands of these models to understand what is the potential variability in the future system. So the researchers are acting in a non-biased way of saying, we're going to run a 10,000 models and try and look at, what is the potential future outcome of a range of different scenarios. And that's really one of the really important things, is that we need to consider this wide range of potential future outcomes.
It's
So
just
not to be
making an
confused by one model or another, it's really um, looking at this and exploring, and they will continue to evolve. So the models that
yeah.
we use today are not the same as what we used 10 years ago.
Right. And models are abstractions of reality. They're
Yep,
a decent guess, but we know
they're
that
always wrong.
they're always wrong, and we haven't got it all figured out. But this is really interesting. This is what I was just writing down, because you sort of made me think of this. Is that I know a lot of times in modeling work, in order to validate or calibrate or estimate, I guess, how well a model is um, forecasting what we think are those connections, we'll often go back and say, well, how well did the model, if I took historic conditions, would it forecast what happened? Right? That's a good
Yeah,
way to validate. You do that with rivers, right?
yeah, yeah. That's one
So,
of the ways we do model verification. Yeah,
right. Okay. So, and so that's a Western science empirical way. But I also makes me think of then the connection to looking back at indigenous traditional knowledge. So this is a wealth of wisdom that's been collected over thousands and thousands of years in these places. And I think of a telling actually that Sonny Laborde shared with me through the Kamloops Tesa, which is in southern British Columbia. And the telling is, and I'll do my best to, hopefully I don't get this too wrong, but the concept is around angst, is how they say it in Secwepemc. And the concept, in my interpretation and how I understand it, is that they realize that if you don't take care of the earth, the sky can turn on you. And that's often how the story was told, because then the weather comes in a way that isn't, as great. If you're not being you don't have a good relationship with water, you're not respecting it. So that's sort of a feedback that they would have probably seen, where things happened and the weather changed. And it's another way of validating what you're saying, is that we could take our tools and we could look back in time, right, to see if they make sense.
mm-hmm. Yeah,
And I think that that's important, because a lot of times uncertainty is brought into these, and you say, well, we don't have a crystal ball and we don't really know. So how do you know your model's any good? And this is one of the ways you know that it's reasonable.
yeah, and I think it's also important to think about this idea of call it epistemic error, or error of in terms of what we know. And with the climate system, it's really, and Earth in general, it's really important to acknowledge that we don't know everything. And we know a lot, but you look at feedbacks, these kind of positive feedbacks that occur. So a positive
Mm,
feedback would be a loop, I guess, that kind of compounds on itself. If you look at melting glaciers and ice sheets, there's a positive feedback there when we think about how much energy is actually reflected back into space. So snow and ice reflect lots of energy back up into space. We remove those and we get, we reflect less energy back up into space.
right.
So understanding that dynamic fully is fairly complicated. And, the models are doing what they can, but it's important to acknowledge that we don't fully understand all of these systems either. And um, I guess accepting that and working within that is also really important. So the past is a good
Mm.
reflection of, things are doing what we think they should, but we may see curveballs in the future that we didn't even think about, and that happens all the time.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to come back to this because this is a cool thing about how the watershed itself could influence the climate that's driving what's happening in the watershed.
Yeah.
This amazing connection. But before we do that, I have to grab my book here, and bad on me for not having my all my resources here. But this is live and real, so deal with it. It's rapid fire question time, and my one of my favorite parts of the show usually unnerves the guest, but don't worry about it, Ryan. I actually, I've been kind of asking tough questions, but I've sort of trimmed it down to we're gonna go fast, okay? So
Okay.
your answers, like these are easy questions, but they're gonna be really interesting. So I think we're gonna have some fun. Are you ready for this?
I'm ready.
Okay. Quick answers, no paragraphs.
Okay.
Ryan, are you a morning person or a night owl?
Morning person.
Morning person, me too. Favorite color?
Green.
Ooh, that's the first person that said that, but I get it. I would have picked blue for you. Do you take naps?
Sometimes, yes.
What's your favorite vehicle?
Oh, probably a Toyota Tacoma,
Ah,
but I don't
I
have
think you
one
drive
anymore.
one of those right now, don't you? Favorite song?
Oh, there's so many.
There are.
Let's go
One
with
of your favorites.
oh, let's go with "Like a River" by Tallest Man on Earth.
Nice. Nice. Uh, what's a guilty pleasure of Ryan MacDonald?
Guilty pleasure. Um, what's one of my guilty pleasures? I really enjoy being super goofy with my dogs. I don't know if that's a guilty pleasure or not, but
I've seen that. I've actually witnessed that, and yeah, that's a guilty pleasure. You're not. I thought you were going to say fly fishing, but anyways, yeah, being goofy
oh
with
yeah,
dogs.
I'm
We're
not
both
guilty
in.
of fly fishing though.
Um, have you ever sang karaoke?
Yes, not well.
Oh man, Lodic or Lentic?
Lodic for sure.
Cool. Um, who would you cast as you in the blockbuster movie Ryan MacDonald: Life and Times?
Oh, for sure, Brad Pitt. He's pretty
Oh,
cute.
and your favorite live stream on YouTube?
This show.
All right, you win the prize. You definitely win the prize, and I didn't even cue him for that. Good job. So, all right, so I want to come back to this connection piece because that's really interesting. Around, there's scales. We were talking about scales in time, but we're talking about scales in space. So you were talking about glaciers, how they not only just contribute, like we think of it, glacial ablation, and they're melting, and eventually there's going to be no more water going into the river. But you're also pointing out this really important thing, which is the reflection of energy back into the atmosphere from all that white ice.
Yeah.
So, um, there's that. Then this also happens in a watershed if, let's say, we clear cut a whole bunch of it, or there's a huge wildfire and thousands of square kilometers are burned and they're black. And that
Yeah,
could
the term
change
is,
how the water comes
yeah,
back, right?
yeah, it totally does. The term is called albedo,
Yeah.
which essentially means the reflectance of a surface in basic terms. But yeah, it's really important. If we change the albedo, and forest fires are a great example, making a surface black, um, you essentially, yeah, can change things like how fast snow melts, um, how water runs off the surface, all those kinds of things.
And I've seen too from, when we used to do prescribed burning in forestry, um, after the burn, sometimes the layer it's hydrophobic and it just repels the water. So that
Yeah,
increases overland transport and doesn't let it back into the ground.
yeah, yeah, another very important dynamic.
So given that, then you've talked about in some of your projects, I've seen where you talk about this idea of synchronizing and desynchronizing watersheds using our land use to affect flow. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so if we can think about um, synchronization or desynchronization as the time in which all the runoff occurs in a watershed. So if you could envision in a kind of a simple conceptual example would be a completely forested area versus a completely clear-cut area. A completely forested area has more shade. Um, the water is being intercepted more by trees. Whereas in a completely clear-cut area, you have less shade and less water that's being intercepted by trees because they're not there. Um, so the time, say if we think about snow melt, the time that it
Mm.
takes to melt the snow is different between those two environments. So in a completely forested watershed, the snow might melt later than in a clear-cut watershed, simply because it's again receiving more energy from the sun. Um, so when we think about desynchronization or synchronization, um, kind of the patchwork of forest cover types and things like aspect and slope ultimately play a role in when runoff occurs in a watershed, and land use can dramatically affect these factors.
Yeah, so I'm trying to
Like your
draw
watershed
here
there.
in my hideous drawing capability, but the two situations you sort of describe on the same landscape, little openings sort of scattered all over on different elevations versus a great big opening, and the output of this watershed is going to be. So you could use forestry not just as something that generates wealth and income and jobs, but you could use it as a tool to control water output.
Yeah, and there have been several research studies that have looked at this, and in British Columbia, Alberta, Washington, all over the place. And really, it depends on what the objective is for that water. Whether it's and we know that watersheds, as you mentioned previously, like they experience change over time. So we do know that kind of a patchwork of forest cover types is kind of a natural thing on the landscape. Um, it's not to say that clear cutting an entire watershed is a natural thing on the landscape. It's to say that watersheds do experience kind of this range of natural variability or disturbance regimes that then ultimately affect the way that water runs off. So in some ways we could use land use or land use activities to try and mimic that. um, you know it's a complex system, and often we don't use land use to try and mimic that kind of natural environment. It's maybe more driven by other factors like economic you know gain, maybe one of them.
Yeah.
But it's important to think about, and even when we think about desynchronization or synchronization, a completely forested landscape, 100, say we had the same age of forest across the entire landscape, would be a fairly synchronized system.
Right.
Likewise, a completely clear-cut landscape would be a fairly synchronized system. So if you just think about variability on the landscape, that's what drives desynchronization.
Cool. It's right back to what you were saying about, the person is never the same and the river is never the same because this change is constant, and
Yeah.
nature is driving it. Big global climate systems are driving it, and people are driving it. So you got to understand all of them, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a connection of things, really.
Totally. And it's a, there's a bunch of work on, say, watershed resilience. It's about having a resilient system. So if you think about the two extremes would be, like a parking lot would be an extremely non-resilient system, that the water from a parking lot runs off very, very quickly and has
Yeah.
nowhere to go. But a resilient system might be this kind of complex patchwork or framework of kind of a wide variety of different functions or features on the landscape that we know all offer different values.
Yeah. Cool. Diversity. Diversity is where the
Diversity,
answer
yeah,
is, and
yeah,
we have to try to hold on to that because that gives us options.
yeah.
All right. Well, let's get into the last segment of the show, which is the CFX library. And I'm going to turn it over to you. Every show, I ask guests ahead of time to share a reference or some place where, if you're really interested in the topic that we're talking about, you can go find out more. And so I asked Ryan to do that. And Ryan, you came up with a book here. I'm going to throw up the cover, and I'll put a link in the show notes for people you can directly go to get this reference if you're interested. So go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, so the book that I thought would be an interesting one for this episode is called Heartwaters, Sources of the Bow River. It's by a fellow named Kevin Van Tighem. Kevin's a pretty awesome author and naturalist from Alberta. And I don't know, we've in our fields we've all kind of had some sort of interaction with Kevin over time. He's got a ton of experience working in the landscape. I think he was the manager of Banff National Park for several, I don't know how long, but a long time. And this book really does point out that interaction between land use, the landscape, climate, and kind of water. And one of the nice quotes that Kevin mentions in that book is, again, water doesn't come from the river, it comes to the river. And that's a really important thing when we think about the landscape and cumulative effects, is that water is actually coming to the river, not from it.
Yeah, and do you know the year that was published, roughly?
Oh, shoot.
Would have been a while ago.
Yeah, probably a good 5 years ago at least.
Because I'm thinking back to that situation we had with High River and Calgary recently, where we had the big floods in the city in the middle of the prairie, but it all came from somewhere else
Yeah,
through the river.
yeah, totally.
So what's happening on the east slopes of the Rockies, not only in terms of the landscape, but the atmospheric conditions, can have these cumulative effects way downstream. So the water comes to the river, but then the river moves the water, right? That's really
Yeah,
cool.
yeah,
And in fact, some of those big systems, like we see, the North and South Saskatchewan, the Mississippi, some of these huge rivers, they the effects, like we often see this in the United States, in the southern United States, where they're getting floodwaters that originated in Manitoba. And
yeah. It's pretty
so,
wild. It's these are big systems, and you talk about those big rivers like the Saskatchewan River. It's a transboundary river crossing multiple provinces, and yeah, it originates from the eastern slopes of the Rockies.
yeah, provincial boundaries, state boundaries, the 49th parallel doesn't mean anything for a watershed unless
No,
there's a dam there,
yeah,
which we've been known to do that too. Well,
yeah,
Ryan, we could go on and on and on about this, but if you are interested in connecting with Ryan or anybody at his company, Go to machydro.ca, right?
Yep.
Yeah, and you can reach Ryan there or other hydrologists and researchers in his company. Um, you can reach out through me as well because I happen to know Ryan quite well and I can connect you. So do that. I have a couple of asks as we come to the close of this show. First of all, I would ask you to hit subscribe and hit the bell. I talk about this every week, but what you're doing is you're telling the algorithm at YouTube that this is good content, and what that will do is help other people see it. So if you found it valuable, you're interested in this, they will too. They just don't know about it. So help us do that. And then I would just also ask you, like, we're trying to build a community here, build momentum of people that are all sort of aligned in our intention of creating a better future by understanding cumulative effects and systems. Hit that little arrow. There's a little arrow there on YouTube that says share. Share that to one person that you know is going to be interested in climate change, hydrology, cumulative effects. Share this video with them. They'll have an opportunity to meet and learn from Ryan, and perhaps they'll want to work with him or his colleagues, and also get access to this great reference from the CFX library. Thanks very much, Ryan, for sharing some of your time with us today. You're always really generous with your time for me, so I'm really grateful for that.
Thank you, Barry. It's been fun.
And so next week we will continue on at our regular time, 11 a.m. Pacific. If you didn't get a chance to see this show live, do absolutely leave your comments and questions below. If you got a specific question, I'll make sure that Ryan gets it and we'll get back to you. So thanks a lot. See you next week.
See ya.